This might be the most old man thing I've ever said on this channel, but I really appreciate an interesting looking venue. ECW ran quite a few of these, making a lot of their shows look unique and interesting. Promotions today hold events in all manner of places, from First Wrestling doing their annual event at the Mall of America, to Game Changer Wrestling having a show seemingly anywhere you can put a ring. These venues help to set promotions apart, and really help to create an interesting atmosphere. Undoubtedly, one of the most interesting that I've ever seen was an Aztec-inspired theatre in, of all places, Queens, New York. It's still there to this day, though rarely if ever used for wrestling. In this video, we'll look at the history of the Elks Lodge in Queens. We'll start with before ECW, then we'll look at the venue itself, some highlights from the ECW years, and its life post-2000. Before arriving in the Elks Lodge, ECW's previous New York venue was the Lost Battalion Hall, which is about a mile down the road. According to reports, the capacity seems to have been anywhere up to 1,200 for the early shows there in 1995. That's more than the Elks Lodge held, which appears to be around 900. Every source gives a different number, and we'll get to the reason for that in a little while. ECW moving from the Lost Battalion Hall to the Elks Lodge could well have come down to money. Presumably the Elks was cheaper if it held less fans. It could also have been because Paul Heyman seemed to really like the place, christening it the Madhouse of Extreme. When ECW was about to begin their ill-fated run on TNN, Paul seemed to want to make sure, against the network's wishes, that the Madhouse would be the site of the first set of tapings for the new show. On September 8, 2013, at a WWE house show at the Barclays Center in Brooklyn, Paul Heyman, standing next to Curtis Axel, would dismiss the 3-year-old arena, which reportedly cost $1 billion to build. He would tell the live crowd that it was a dump compared to an Elks Lodge in Queens, nearly 13 years after he would have last set foot there. One more idea, and this is just me speculating, is that it could have also come down to the Lost Battalion Hall being under the New York City Department of Parks and Rec, which I bet is nowhere near as fun as it looks on TV. While ECW always had an edge to it, I doubt a government building and flaming tables would have gone down all too well together. Before we get to the Elks Lodge's history with wrestling, a little background on the building itself. To use its proper name, Elks Lodge number 878 had long since stopped being a member-only establishment by the time ECW arrived. The main part of the building was put up for sale by the Elks in '95 and would eventually be used as a church, and still is to this day. More on that later, as it almost stopped shows taking place there several times. The most distinct part of the venue is the amazing Aztec-inspired carvings that surround the stage and wrap around the balcony. If only Lucha Underground had been able to film there before the once colourful theatre was painted a much more dull colour. According to an article published in 2011 for ScoutingNewYork.com, this was done by the current owners to make the imagery a little less intimidating. They used a different word. In the 2013 documentary Barbed Wire City, ECW fan and attendee of the Elks Lodge Tony Lewis provided a tour of the venue outside and in, with some rather unique insights. He starts by showing us a fire escape and tells us that the majority of the ring had to be carried 2 floors up outside of the building, as this is where the lower level of the theatre was. When he shows us the inside, he points out a window that parts of the ring would have to be pushed through. If you, like I have ever watched a show from the Elks Lodge and wondered how they fit the reported attendance figures of up to 1,000 fans into the small-looking venue, the simplest answer is sometimes the best. Tony tells us that a plaque used to be up on the wall, telling us that the max capacity for the theatre was 653. And ECW would break this regularly, with complete and total disregard. I'll not tell you everything that Tony shares, and I'll also include a link to the full segment in the description, because it really is worth a watch. But one final thing I will add is about a local legend that the Elks Lodge could call its own. their version of the Straw Hat Guy. In fact, here's Tony to tell you.
You know, the way the ECW Arena has a hat guy and sign guy, we had Assman. Assman was a guy, he weighed about 500 pounds, and we called him Assman because he used to always moon the Dudleys.
By the time ECW started putting on shows there, wrestling had already been promoted in the Elks Lodge before. The Pro Wrestling Torch listed an event from January 97 for a promotion called Ultimate Championship Wrestling, a few months before ECW first ran there. The most notable names that were on this card were ECW talent Tommy Cairo and ex-WWF stars Jim Neidhart, and in the main event, Chris Chavis without the Tatanka gimmick, who beat King Kong Bundy by countout. Not a 5 count, I assume. Going even further back, in the Wrestling Observer, there's evidence of a promotion called the Universal Wrestling Superstars, running there in '92. This card advertised Jimmy Snuka against Demolition Axe. Just Axe, mind. UWS ran the New York and New Jersey area starting in the late 80s. Their last event in Queens was the card the Observer referenced in '92, but the promotion would keep going elsewhere until '97. And right to the end, they would continue to feature local talent on the undercard and former WWF stars on top. Their last main event would be Jimmy Snuka vs Typhoon. So now we get to ECW's time at the Elks Lodge. Overall, there are 19 events, some TV tapings and others house shows that took place here. This isn't going to be a comprehensive deep dive, because we'd be here for hours. I will stop off at everything of note though, in relation to the venue. On April 5th, 1997, ECW ran their first event at the Madhouse. The first thing to note about this event is that it took place just 8 days before Barely Legal, the company's first pay-per-view, and a huge milestone for the company. Despite not being an official TV taping, and only filmed by the fan cam, footage would air on the last episode of Hardcore TV before the pay-per-view, making this the first time that Elks Lodge appeared on a televised wrestling show. They would show part of a match between Rob Van Dam and Pitbull No. 2, where Van Dam hit a dive and unintentionally clocked Pitbull 1, who medics rushed to in case he had re-injured his broken neck. Shane Douglas would run in and attack him, which was part of the final build towards him versus Pitbull 2 at Barely Legal. Also on the episode, ECW would air a 3-team tag title match featuring the Gangsters and the 2 teams who would meet again on the pay-per-view, the Dudley Boys and the Eliminators. In this match, New Jack would perform a balcony dive on the very first show in the building, mind. These 2 segments would be the only parts of the show that would ever air on Hardcore TV. After the first show at the Madhouse, Paul Heyman would gush about the night in an interview with The Torch. In my opinion, we had our best spot show, if not our best house show, ever in Queens on Saturday night. The audience was so into the show. It was one of our best shows. Yeah, alright Paul, you're sounding like another promoter. While the fans at the Elks Lodge were getting to see title matches and TV episodes being taped now, it would be a little bit longer before they would actually see a championship change hands. On October 16th, which would again be a TV taping, Bam Bam Bigelow would defeat Shane Douglas for the ECW World title. In all of the events that ECW would have at the Elks Lodge, this would be the one and only world title change, though Shane would win his title back a month later at the November to Remember pay-per-view. Hardcore TV would show future world title changes, but this would be the last one to take place specifically to air on that show, with many after taking place on pay-per-view and a couple happening on TNN. You'd have to look to the WWE ECW days to find the next time the ECW world title changed hands, with so few viewers watching, mainly because half the crowd had their backs turned. The final noteworthy event from 1997 came on December 26th, which could have become an annual tradition for ECW, as they held an event there on the same night in '98 too. This show starts off unlike any regular ECW show, in that it featured a match between two New Japan wrestlers. The Great Sasuke, who had wrestled for ECW early in the year, including at Barely Legal, would face Tiger Mask 4, who along with the Next Night in New Jersey was making his only 2 appearances for the company. The two get off to a slow start, and the crowd begins to boo, even calling out bullshit, and some quite offensive against the Japanese chants as the two exchange holds on the mat. While the Torch says nothing about this match, Wade Keller notes that when the two had a rematch on the following night, the crowd chanted boring and this match sucks early on. The only match of the night that would be taped for television would air on January 5th, and it would be an 8-man tag team match that played on the ECW vs WWF feud that had been taking place for months by then. The ECW team of Taz, Sandman, Tommy Dreamer and Al Snow would defeat the WWF team of Doug Furnas, Phil LaFon, Rob Van Dam and Sabu. I promise it makes more sense in the context of the feud why Sabu was on the WWF team, and I am oversimplifying it a bit. Al Snow, who was actually a WWF signed wrestler who had been sent to ECW and developed his new character there, would get the win by roll-up on Doug Furnas, and by summer would be back on Raw, this time bringing Head with him. The multi-person tag match where the good guys triumph would become something of a tradition, as the next year, New Jack, Balls Mahoney and Axl Rotten would best the Dudley Boys to send the crowd home happy. After a few months away, ECW would return to the Madhouse on March 13th with an event that the Observer noted had been sold out several days ahead of time. Dave makes note that the capacity is 800, but in the following week's issue lists 1,000 as the attendance. Either Paul is inflating the numbers, or the fire code took a pounding on this night. ECW's next show at the Elks Lodge is one of the more important ones, as a few memorable moments took place. It's known for having one of the most distinctive names of any ECW show. It ain't Seinfeld, named as such because on the same night the final episode of Seinfeld was airing. Now this is completely irrelevant, but growing up as a kid in the UK, we didn't really have Seinfeld, Jerry or the sitcom, and so for years I had no fucking clue what that name actually meant. This show's notable for more than just its name though, as Taz came to the ring with a bag in his hand. He would explain that he felt the world champion Shane Douglas had been ducking him, and that a man from Pittsburgh could never beat a man from Brooklyn anyway. He presents to the world his own custom-made championship, first calling it the Brooklyn World Belt, then the name it would be better known as, the FTW title. On this occasion, FTW did not mean for the win as it might today. It stood for F the World, 3 words that Taz's on-screen persona embodied. In January 99, at Guilty as Charged, Taz would defeat Shane Douglas for the real ECW World title, and the FTW belt felt like a way of keeping that from happening until the time was right. Douglas would remain champion throughout the whole of '98 and would almost seem a bit lost without it. One more thing of note that occurred on this night was a pretty epic moment that I'm sure the management of the Elks Lodge weren't thrilled by. That said, the first show there did have a New Jack balcony dive, and they came back. The whole '98 version of the Dudley Boys, as well as their manager Joel Gertner, would come to the ring to what I believe would be called nuclear heat. The crowd viciously boos as the Dudley Boys spit venom right back, paying specific attention to one individual they picked out on the balcony. Perhaps not expecting anything to come of this, the Dudley clan attempted to goad the fan into climbing down the balcony, getting in the ring. They even promised that they would make sure he would not be kicked out or worse. These were the days where if a fan climbed in the ring, they would get whatever the wrestler who happened to be in there felt they deserved. The tie-dyed trolls moved on with their promo, but after a few minutes, the fan would descend from the balcony and make his way towards the guardrail. Thankfully, security would get to him before anything else could happen, and the Dudleys would continue on with their promo. This does go to show though, just how incensed the fans could get while being taunted by the Dudleys. As best I can tell from the newsletters at the time, nothing seemed to have come from this, and the Elks clearly didn't mind, or care, that a fan had dropped from the balcony to try and get in the ring. In August, ECW would, through a situation out of their control, lose their television presence in New York City, Philadelphia and Atlanta, the first two being very important markets for the company. While they were able to get new airings in the latter two, New York proved to be much more difficult. ECW would end up going months without any television in New York. Despite this, ECW continued to run shows in New York City, and in September at the Madhouse they would come up with a very expensive and frankly insane sounding way of keeping fans invested. On the 9/17 Queen's show, as the crowd of about 800 left the building, Paul Heyman and Tommy Dreamer were at the exits giving everyone videotapes of the past 3 television shows since ECW has been off TV in the New York market, and basically Heyman wanted the loyal New York fans to see the recent TV shows. The goodwill gesture cost in total about $4,100, between the cost of the tapes and the dubbing and transporting of about 1,000 tapes to the arena. As I'm sure you can probably imagine, given the time and cost that would have taken, ECW only did this once, leaving their New York fans without access to their television at the next show in November. ECW didn't pass out tapes of the TV show to all the fans at the Queen show, as they had promised the previous show they'd do, as long as they didn't have New York TV, claiming a problem with the fire marshal, but did take everyone's name and promised to mail them the last 4 weeks worth of television shows. As far as I can tell, this never happened. Before we leave 1998, there was one more event at the Elks Lodge that received some attention from the newsletters, though it wasn't promoted by ECW. It is, as best I can tell, the first non-ECW show to take place at the Elks Lodge while the promotion was running shows there. On October 10th, the Long Island Wrestling Federation would promote a card held in the memory of the Junkyard Dog, who had passed away in June '98. The show would include many an ex-WWF talent, such as Tito Santana, Demolition Axe, again without Smash, Jimmy Snuka and more. What's strange though, is seeing these names alongside some of the future stars of the 2000s indies, most notably Homicide and Loki. More on them later. A couple of ECW names also worked the show, including Spanish Angel and Skull Von Crush, who would be part of the Baldies group later on. LIWF would run one more event at the Elks during ECW's time there in early '99, but ECW soon wouldn't be running there either. As we get to 1999, ECW would run 4 times at the Madhouse, but a big problem was emerging. If you look purely at ticket sales, which are usually one of a wrestling promotion's most important revenue streams, you'd be forgiven for thinking that everything was fine. But ECW's money problems were still growing. Checks were bouncing, talent were being owed more and more, and Paul Heyman was having to look for deals that might save the company. By this point, ECW had sold out the Elks Lodge many times in a row, and continued to through the upcoming year. But if this wasn't making enough money for the company, it raises the question of should they have been running the smaller venues anymore. On the weekend of ECW's first Elks Lodge show of the year, they ran a sold-out 1,100 capacity show in Freeport, New York on the Friday, 1,000 in the Madhouse on Saturday, and 3,000 on Sunday in Poughkeepsie. The Observer would make an interesting comment about this. There is some question as to whether or not the full houses in small venues can pay for the enormous television bills the company has, since it buys time in most major markets it plays. The estimated $250,000 per year bill for MSG Cable, for example, can hardly be made up running 1,000-seat buildings in the New York market. Dave seems to be specifically talking about the Elks Lodge without ever naming it. Heyman has steadfastly run shows that are admitted money losers because the television looks good, particularly from New York, and being able to pack houses rather than risk moving to larger buildings and potentially not selling out. As far as the content of the show, the fans were treated to some stellar wrestling and a surprising twist. I did say some stellar wrestling. Crossing the line on February 12th would include one of the many singles matches between Yoshihiro Tajiri and Super Crazy, who had quick become intense rivals since Tajiri's debut in December. And the main event of the night would see another famous ECW rivalry revisited, as Rob Van Dam would defend the television title against Jerry Lynn. The two would, a month later, meet again at Living Dangerously in what might be their most famous match, so to see it in a much more intimate setting must have felt special. This night was also the setting for a match that never was, which turned into a major storyline. Originally, the Dudley Boys were slated to have a dream match of sorts with the Public Enemy, which would have been billed as ECW's past greatest tag team against their present greatest. When asked about his opinion of the Public Enemy by The Torch a few months later, Paul Heyman responded they should have showed up in Queens to do the favour for the Dudleys. It looked like a different tag team from the early days of ECW were going to clash with the Dudleys, as Mustafa would return to the company to stand alongside New Jack, who was already feuding with them. However, Mustafa would actually turn on his former partner, setting up a match between he and New Jack at Living Dangerously. On April 24th, the company would return to New York, but the most interesting thing about this show was what was going on backstage, as Paul Heyman would receive some unexpected visitors who were after money that was owed to them. Tommy Rogers and Sid, who were both working the weekend in the area for Mike O'Brien's Northeast Wrestling, showed up at the April 24th Queen show to get settled on some previously bounced checks. Sid was owed $6,000 and Rogers a much lesser amount, and both were paid off, although there ended up being a scene between Rogers and Paul Heyman over it. Sid would end up only making 2 more appearances for ECW before signing with WCW, but it's doubtful that those would have happened had Paul not paid him on this night. Despite all the money problems, there were opportunities coming that Paul Heyman hoped would help turn things round. The biggest of these was the TNN deal, which, after months of negotiations, Heyman would land in June. Paul would waste little time announcing the deal to the world, and he would do so in the middle of the ring at the Madhouse on July 3rd. A week before this at the ECW arena, Paul would hold a meeting with the wrestlers, hoping to unify them ahead of the announcement, and attempting to lift their spirits. He asked that they be a team, and support the company because the next few months would be an exciting period of growth, with everyone soon thereafter getting rewarded for their patience. Paul was very much insistent that the good times were coming, telling The Torch in an interview in July that ECW was never going to go out of business, no matter how bleak things had looked from the outside. It seems though that whether ECW planned on addressing the size of its venues or not, they might have had to leave the Elks Lodge not by choice. The first TNN taping, which would take place at the Madhouse on August 26th, was set by the venue itself to be the final wrestling event to take place there. For this reason, the show is also known under the name Last Night at the Madhouse. It seems though that at least for a while this may not have been the case. The Queen show was scheduled to be the final show in the Moose Lodge, as it's been converted into a church. However, the building's management, who are said to be usually stuffy and nonchalant, got caught up in the emotion of the evening and decided to book a final show at the building on December 18th. Heyman says the show will not be a TV taping because he wants it to be more of an intimate night for the Queen's fans, who he's said to consider among the best in wrestling. This December show is never mentioned again in The Torch or The Observer, and on the date that the event was penciled in for, ECW would actually run a show in Chattanooga as part of a 3-show tour of Tennessee. Still, at the time that the show was being booked, ECW thought that it was the last night at the Madhouse, and so Paul booked a memorable show. August 26, 1999 was set to be the last night in the company for Bubba Ray and Devon Dudley, who won the tag team titles from Balls Mahoney and Spike Dudley, threatening to take them to WWF. Thankfully, this wouldn't happen, as the Dudleys would lose the titles later in the night to Tommy Dreamer and the returning Hero. Following a very public walkout from WCW, the former ECW World Champion Raven would make a surprise return much earlier than expected, given that he had only walked out on a WCW Nitro taping on August 23rd, just days before this event. At some point in the night, the Torch says that Heyman came to the ring to address the fans about the TNN debut. A few fans chanted Raven, and Heyman told them, "You'll get Raven in 91 days. In a move that would shock the Madhouse fans, Raven would enter through the crowd, drop Bubba with a DDT, and pin him to win the tag titles with Dreamer, his hated rival. Tommy would look at Raven like he'd seen a ghost, and he would spend the next few weeks reckoning with the idea that his biggest rival was back." The next few times ECW would run TV tapings in New York, it would be in much larger venues than the Elks Lodge, in Buffalo and White Plains. It's possible to say then by this point that ECW had, at least for the time being, outgrown the small Queens venue. Despite this, ECW would eventually return to the Madhouse one final time, under very different circumstances. By November of 2000, ECW was in a much rougher shape. TNN was gone, and the company would be a few months from the end. ECW was a few weeks away from a new pay-per-view event they had added to their calendar, called Massacre on 34th Street. Because of several cancelled shows, there was a worry that they might not have enough footage in the can to get them to the event. As a result, according to The Observer, there was work done to try to do a last-minute booking of the Elks Lodge in Queens, New York, where ECW used to tape hot TVs because it's only an 800-seat arena that ECW can fill with a week of publicity for some time over Thanksgiving weekend to shoot some new angles for the pay-per-view. This event would end up not taking place because there wasn't enough time to finalise the deal and get the publicity out on television. They still may add a date in that building before the end of the year, with the idea of making it an extra special house show and charging a high ticket price for the event. This one would end up happening, with some very special guests. Bubba Ray and Devon Dudley would make one final appearance for ECW in the same venue they left in. In early December, The Observer would report on cancelled events in Texas. This meant that after the December 3rd pay-per-view, the next ECW event would be the 15th in the Elks Lodge. The Madhouse show was a high ticket price event in order to try and catch up on bills, which was originally December 21st, but moved up 1 week because ECW would have had nothing for TV on 12/22. Unfortunately for ECW though, the show wouldn't draw as much money as the company needed it to. While it sold out the 800 seats, the show failed to overflow with standing room as it usually did in the past, with tickets jacked up to $40 and $60. But what happened on the card itself? The show was built around the return of the Dudleys, who worked the main event, teaming with Tommy Dreamer over Simon Diamond, Swinger and Anderson, and were clearly the stars of the show by leaps and bounds over the regulars. While this was sure to get a reaction from the fans at the Madhouse, not everyone was happy, as many were upset regarding the Dudleys not selling anything for the ECW guys. In particular, Bubba not putting over the C.W. Anderson left hand, which they push on television. Leading up to the night, ECW had been promoting another surprise star, who would turn out to be Taz, who would help the tag team champions Danny Doring and Roadkill. This may sound like an odd pairing, but Doring and Roadkill were actually protégés of Taz, two of the few graduates of the House of Hardcore training school. This return by Taz seems to have been received much better. Taz tried to give them a rub afterwards, and apparently did a great job with the interview, doing his old catchphrase with a twist: beat them if you can, survive if they let you. With ECW not long for the world, the December 15th show marks a sort of end of an era. It doesn't mean, however, that wrestling stopped at the Elks Lodge though, nor was it the end for ECW wrestlers appearing there. In February 2001, another promotion would swoop in to take their place. Chris Candido, Cash, Tajiri, Baldies, Mahoney and Whipwreck, as well as Elektra and Missy Hyatt, all worked the January 26th show for Ultimate Championship Wrestling in Queens at the Elks Lodge, the site of numerous ECW TV tapings, drawing about 400 fans. The Observer in December notes that this is a new promotion holding their first show, not the same Ultimate Wrestling superstars that I mentioned earlier. As well as the former ECW talent they booked, they also included several talents who had become prominent names in the 2000s. The Amazing Red, Homicide and Loki, and the SAT, who would all work for Ring of Honor when that got started, would mix with half the ECW roster. If I'm being really blunt, the ones that WWE didn't take. The other notable thing about UCW is that their shows appeared to me marathons. This card from June of 2001 has 15 matches on it, including a one-night tournament and a battle royal. In September, UCW would run a free show at the Elks Lodge and apparently expected it to be rammed with people. This wouldn't be the case though. According to those there, because it was free, it would have been expected to be a packed house, but only drew about 400 people. Loki and Red apparently tore the house down with a 4-star caliber match. At first, there was annoyingly little information about Ultimate Championship Wrestling out there, not even a logo, and no listed events beyond this free event in late 2001. I noticed though that their shows would include title defenses for Impact Championship Wrestling, which would continue to run the Elks Lodge until 2015, eventually becoming ICW No Holds Barred, which is still running today. Another notable company that would begin to run the Elks was USA Pro Wrestling, which began in New Jersey in '96 and first ran the former Madhouse in 2000. Promoted until 2021 by former wrestler Frank Goodman, USA Pro appears to build a gap between being one of those companies I talked about earlier, main evented by 80s WWF stars, to later booking ex-ECW guys as well as indie talent. According to this note from The Observer, they were still booking Snooker vs Bundy as late as 2000. Can you imagine? In 2003, Frank Goodman's USA Pro would actually have a hand in another company being able to run their first ever show in New York. That company is known as Ring of Honor. There have been a few cases over the years of promotions needing to co-promote with a company that already has a license in New York. Perhaps most famously, when AAA planned to run Madison Square Garden, they had to co-promote with Impact, and New Japan did this with Ring of Honor for their MSG show. In this case, ROH co-promoted using Frank Goodman's license. It was reported in November 2002 in The Observer that ROH will debut in New York at the Elks Lodge in Queens on February 8th, in a joint promotion with Frank Goodman's USA Pro Wrestling, which, since it'll be their license, will be the promotion of record. Ring of Honor, with the help of USA Pro, would hold their 1-year anniversary event at the Elks Lodge, the only ROH show that would ever be held there. This could potentially be because of a storyline riot that would get a bit out of control that would happen halfway through the show, and that not being a great look for the building predominantly used as a church by this point. Another potential reason for no return date is that after years of threatening, the Elks Lodge in Queens, which had been rumoured for years dating back to the ECW days to be shutting down wrestling, is going to do so in September. While a little later than planned, USA Pro Wrestling would host the apparent last show at the Elks Lodge, titled End of an Era. The 15-match card included a mix of up-and-coming indie talent and grizzled ECW veterans. In the main event, Raven would defend the USA Pro Heavyweight title against Al Snow in a match that would last 45 minutes. Can you imagine anything more threatening sounding than an almost hour-long Al Snow match on a 15-bout card? Before you say a half-an-hour video on this channel, yeah, probably. This is the third video that I've made for this channel about a former ECW venue, and it's the only one that still to this day is predominantly known as theirs, approaching 25 years since the company closed its doors. Unlike the Hammerstein Ballroom and the 2300 Arena, which have hosted many promotions since, the Madhouse of Extreme has stayed at the indie level when it has hosted wrestling. This is in part due to the new ownership, but the size of the venue doesn't help either, or that fire escape. Early on in my reading for this video, I found this quote from an observer that stuck with me about the Elks Lodge. It perhaps explains why major promotions never seem to run there, not since ECW at least. One of ECW's problems is that Heyman has often presented the product in buildings for atmosphere, such as the ECW Arena or the Elks Lodge in Queens, but that even with a full house, the show itself ends up being a money loser. For better or worse, and I think history will probably say for worse, Paul Heyman had an interesting philosophy when it came to how he chose his venues. Heyman, whose background from the nightclub business before wrestling taught him, it's better for the illusion of the club to pack a small hall than to draw twice as many people in a 3 times as large building. Taking in more money, but having empty seats gives the impression that it's not a hot product. This is the mentality of someone who wants to deliver the perception of a really hot product, one that the fans are desperate to get through the door for, but not necessarily one that will sell enough tickets to sustain itself. Herein lies the problem with ECW running the smaller venues. Had they lived into the 2000s, who knows where they could have found, or what ways they could have found, to draw bigger crowds. Thank you for watching yet another wrestling channel. If you enjoyed this, please comment, like or subscribe.